Hey guys, tonight we're going way back to the land of Reed's gods with magnificent eyebrows and clay tablets that didn't forgive a single typo. We're in ancient Sumer, where being a scribe meant having the worst seat in the temple, no erasers, and a front row view of every royal meltdown. Tonight, you'll wake before dawn, squint at a lump of moist clay that looks suspiciously like regret, and try to impress a man whose idea of a compliment is not yelling, "You missed the wedge for barley," in front of a goat. You probably won't survive this, not because of bandits or plagues, though those exist, but because one day after 10 hours of writing the same symbol for grain offering with a cracked stylus, your back gives out, and you realize you've spelled God like duck. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. I love knowing which corner of the world we're sleeping through together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up to the sound of roosters, not alarm clocks. And not just one rooster, 6, all off-key, all competing to ruin your morning in increasingly shrill tones. The mat beneath you is itchy. The room smells like old straw ink that dried badly, and a corner of last night's barley stew someone forgot to cover. Your shoulders already ache. Your knees creak like ungreased hinges. You haven't even sat up yet. Welcome to scribal life in ancient Sumer. The light outside is golden and soft, filtering through the reed thatch roof. It would be beautiful if you didn't know that within 20 minutes, you'll be hunched over a wooden board with a damp piece of clay trying to wedge your way through 300 temple receipts before breakfast. You rise, you stretch, you accidentally step on a pebble. It feels personal. Your tools are simple, a stylus made from a trimmed piece of reed splintered at the edge because you dropped it yesterday. A palette with nothing on it, because ink isn't a thing here. Everything is pressed into damp clay. Wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform, painstakingly etched in lines so fine they look like the mutterings of an obsessive bird. Your workplace is a sunlit courtyard near the temple granary. There are flies, always flies, and sweating men who think accounting is a sport that involves yelling. You sit cross-legged beside a large basket of blank clay tablets. They're heavy, cool to the touch, and as inviting as unbaked bricks. Your job today: record every grain measure brought in by farmers from 6 nearby villages, each with their own accent, their own math, and their own opinion on how many goats count as a favor. Mainstream historians often romanticize scribes, keepers of knowledge, early scientists, preservers of epics. And sure, technically yes. But what they leave out is the constant clay dust in your lungs, the inkless writing, the sore hips, the hours spent trying to decide if someone said 2 baskets or too many baskets because Sumerian has no punctuation and the man talking to you has barley in his beard. You begin with the first farmer who gestures vaguely and says, "The same as last time plus the extra." You pause, "The same as what?" He shrugs. A goat sneezes nearby. Fringe scholars suggest that early scribes may have developed short-term memory systems far superior to ours simply to survive the chaos. One theory claims that after 5 years, a seasoned scribe could recall any tax figure from the last 3 months and whether the man who said it had spinach between his teeth. You write carefully, one wedge at a time. The clay is too wet. The stylus slips. You fix the line, but now the meaning is unclear. Does this say 3 baskets of emmer wheat, or 3 curses on your descendants? It's a fine line. You try to flag down your mentor, a stooped man who's been scribbling since the time of the last flood myth, but he's busy arguing with a priest about whether a shipment of barley should be counted twice if it passed through 2 cities. You're on your own, and the sun is climbing, and your back is stiffening, and the next man in line drops a sack of dates on your scroll mat. You sigh. Historians still argue whether scribes were respected or just tolerated. They had power, yes, access to records, to temples, to the ear of the gods. but they also had inkless cramps, sunburned necks, and the eternal terror of being asked to rewrite something when the clay was already dry. You press on, literally. Mid-morning, a supervisor strolls by and inspects your tablet. He frowns. Your lines are slanted. Are you writing angry again? You weren't, but now you are. By noon, you've recorded 14 deliveries, missed lunch, and swallowed a bit of clay from licking your fingers out of habit. You stand to stretch, and your knees sound like a small earthquake. A passing priest tells you to sit more humbly. You nod. You sit. Your foot falls asleep. You write one more line, and then the wind picks up. Light, playful, treacherous. It knocks over your drying tablet pile. You lunge. You catch one. The rest scatter. One lands in a basin of rinse water. You stare. You reconsider your career. You hear someone say, "That's why I became a brewer." And for a second you think maybe, but then you sigh, collect the tablets, and start again, because you're a scribe. And this is just the morning. You settle into your writing mat again after noon, only slightly soggier and significantly more resigned. The sun has shifted, baking the courtyard in that specific way that makes the clay feel like it's actively judging your skin. You roll your shoulders. You flex your fingers. You pick up your stylus, the same stubby reed you've used for the past 3 weeks, and it immediately splinters. A small shard lodges under your fingernail. You hiss. You consider your life choices. This right here is the glamorous world of stylus blisters and scribal calluses. No one warns you about this part. In the romantic tales painted in temple murals or recited in evening wine circles, the scribe is always a noble figure, back straight lines flowing, preserving civilization one wedge at a time. But in reality, your back is curved like a bad fishhook. Your thumb has developed a permanent ridge from gripping reeds too tightly, and there is a small but furious ache that now lives full-time in your right shoulder. Mainstream historians describe the stylus as a simple instrument, just a reed cut to a fine angled tip. But they tend to skip the part where that tip cracks when the clay is too firm, or warps in humid weather, or stabs you every third use. You've fashioned half a dozen in your lifetime, and snapped at least twice as many. You try to remember when your hand didn't feel like it belonged to a 70-year-old basket weaver. It's a distant memory. You swap in a new stylus from your belt pouch. It's blunt on one end and slightly sticky from a spilled fig. You press into the clay again. The impression is weak. You press harder. Now it's too deep. You try to fix it. The fix looks like a squashed fish. You sigh and start the line again. Fringe scholars have uncovered training tablets from young scribes, early exercises that read like school punishments. The stylus must be steady. The line must be level. The hand must obey, over and over. Hundreds of repetitions. One poor student carved the phrase, "I hate this clay," 27 times before apparently giving up mid-tablet. You empathize. The worst part. The cramp. That slow, creeping knot that starts at your wrist, wraps around your forearm, and eventually slithers into your shoulder like a vengeful garden snake. It doesn't just hurt, it lingers. You stretch flex, rub it against your knee. Nothing helps. You press on anyway. Because there are still half a dozen temple receipts to copy, and 2 more priests have arrived with sacrificial ledgers that apparently needed to be documented yesterday. At this point, your hand is no longer under your control. It twitches. It spasms. It occasionally writes the wrong symbol and then stares at you with the blank guilt of a rebellious chicken. You miss the days when you could make a fist without regretting it. You glance around the courtyard. One elder scribe is massaging his forearm with a pestle. Another is using a small jade roller to coax the cramp out of his palm. You consider both options, and instead just lie down on your mat. The clay beside you dries slowly. You feel it mocking you with its firmness. No blisters, no cramps, just smug silence. Historians still debate whether scribes were expected to write daily or in shifts. Some say they alternated duties. Scribe one day, reader the next. Others believe that full-time writing was the norm, especially during festival seasons or tax audits. You're inclined to believe the latter. Your fingers certainly do. A messenger arrives mid-afternoon with a fresh batch of contracts from the granary. He drops them with the enthusiasm of a man unburdened by stylus-based trauma. You groan quietly and sit back up. The clay is damp, heavy, slightly warped. One tablet is already cracked. You add it to the maybe salvageable pile, which is right next to the definitely cursed pile. You've worn a ridge into your writing mat from where your elbow always leans. Your robe sleeve is stained with dust and sweat and something that might be date paste from yesterday's lunch. You haven't straightened your spine in 3 hours, and still you press on, because while your hand hates you, your brain is oddly focused. There's a rhythm to it now. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. The wedge impressions come quicker, almost fluid. You don't even think about it anymore. You just record. Symbols for grain symbols for debt symbols for the goat has escaped again. You could write them in your sleep. You suspect you already have. A boy from the junior class walks past, stares at your posture and whispers, "I hope I die before I'm that bent." You hear him. You don't respond, because you're already shaping the next line. Already smoothing the next clay slab. Already imagining the moment you'll soak your hand in cool water at sunset and wonder why anyone thinks being a brickmaker is somehow worse. Historians still argue whether scribes received physical therapy or any kind of medical attention for repetitive strain. There's no direct record, just a few prescriptions involving crushed mint leaf and goat milk applied to the wrist, which frankly sound like either a cure or a prank. You resolve to try it anyway. Because your hand is on fire, because the stylus is splintered again, because the inkless art of clay writing has no mercy, only more symbols, and because tomorrow your palm will blister in the same place all over again. It's mid-morning now, and your stylus has become a spiteful, slippery dagger of regret. You shift your weight on the writing mat, flexing your toes for no real reason, except that they're the only part of your body not currently experiencing professional betrayal. The sun has crept higher, dragging its heat across the courtyard, like a bored god with no chill. And in your hand, your next clay tablet lies damp, stubborn, and judgmental, because this one needs to be perfect. Why? Because there's no ink, no corrections, no takebacks, no gentle blotting or cheerful do-overs. This, dear listener, is the inkless, utterly permanent misery of writing in clay. You wouldn't think it'd be that bad. Just a bit of pressure, right? A few tidy wedges and you're on your way. But no, writing in clay is a dance between moisture, gravity, and the slow realization that the eraser is your own trembling thumb smeared against still wet impressions, risking obliteration of not just words, but meaning. Mainstream historians explain that cuneiform, one of the world's earliest writing systems, was developed in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE. They'll marvel at the ingenuity of making language out of lines. What they fail to mention is the panic sweat involved when you misspell barley tax as wedding goat on a temple receipt that gets filed for eternity. There is no parchment here, no paper, no quill, no forgiving ink to fade away gently with time. This is clay. It remembers everything. It will outlive you. It will outlive your descendants. It will sit buried in sand for 5,000 years, waiting for someone in a museum to look at it and say, this guy really had no idea how to spell silo. You pick up your stylus. The point is uneven. You shave it delicately with a shell. Too sharp and you'll gouge the clay. Too blunt and the symbols blur together into prehistoric gibberish. You press, just lightly. A wedge, another. Then you hesitate. Did you place that diagonal right? Is that an ash or a dumu? You squint. You panic. You wipe. You ruin the entire line. Fringe scholars often argue about clay moisture levels too dry, and it cracks too wet and it slumps. There are even ancient tablets with scribal marginalia that read, "Wet again." May Enlil curse this batch, Others feature corrections where the original symbol is scratched out with a stylus and a revised line added below in a different hand, possibly with a note, by order of the head scribe. Do better. You toss that ruined tablet aside into the pile euphemistically called later drying. You start again, this time slower, with the concentration of a man diffusing a sleep-deprived porcupine. You're supposed to be copying a temple record, a log of oil deliveries from one city to another, across a series of canals with names longer than most arguments. The original sits beside you, half-faded, etched into a cracked tablet, with the neatness of a scribe who clearly cared. You do not love this man. You resent his precision. You curse his clean wedges and emotionally stable margins. You press on, one wedge at a time. The problem is, each symbol must be perfect. Cuneiform isn't cursive. You can't flow from one shape to another. Every line is a separate commitment. Vertical, horizontal, diagonal. Some signs look almost identical except for one angle or an extra flick. Miss one, and grain tax paid in full becomes grain tax still owed and possibly doubled. Please send goats. And when the supervisor reads your work, because yes, there is always a supervisor, he'll trace it line by line with a tiny stylus of his own. If he sees a smudge, a wobble, or the faint impression of your thumb where it didn't belong, he will make a face like he's just smelled rotten fish and instruct you to begin again with more reverence. You begin again with less reverence, with barely restrained sarcasm. You mentally imagine throwing your stylus into the canal and becoming a date seller, or a boat builder, or a priest, though you've heard the sandals are worse. You've now rewritten the same 5 lines 3 times. Your back aches, your wrist is stiff, and somewhere behind you a novice scribe lets out a strangled cry. His stylus has snapped mid-inscription. You feel it in your bones. You don't turn. You simply nod in grim mutual understanding. Historians still argue whether cuneiform's complexity was a bureaucratic tool or an accidental byproduct of too many temple staff with too much time. Some claim it was intentionally difficult, meant to gatekeep literacy and make scribes indispensable. Others believe it evolved messily sign by sign, like a language grown in a cracked pot and watered with barley wine. You believe both. The afternoon slips on. The clay gets stickier. The heat builds. Your tablet is 3/4 finished when a passing priest tips his basket and a single droplet of oil arcs through the air and lands directly in the center of your nearly completed work. You stare at the glistening splatter. It's shaped like irony. You don't yell. You don't cry. You just very gently press your forehead to the tablet and whisper a word not safe for temple walls. Then you begin again, because this is the inkless world, where every mistake is forever, and your stylus, like your soul, is always one press away from snapping. The first time you held a stylus, you thought it was a wand, a small reed light in the hand, angled at the tip like it knew secrets. You were 6 barefoot belly full of lentils, and convinced you'd just inherited the power to command the gods, or at the very least, to summon extra figs. You pressed it into a block of training clay. Your first wedge came out crooked. Your second looked like a crushed beetle. The instructor said nothing, just handed you another tablet and told you to do it again, and again, and again. Welcome to the Aduba, the Sumerian schoolhouse, where dreams go to dry out in the sun and re-emerge as accounting interns. Your classroom is a shaded courtyard behind the temple. Stone benches, reed mats, a dozen boys each with their own clay tray stylus and existential crisis. It is not a cheerful place. It smells of sweat-crushed millet and disappointment. The headmaster, known only as Father of the Tablet, walks with a staff and the air of a man who's had to explain the difference between sheep and sacrificial sheep for 30 years. Mainstream historians portray Adubas as elite institutions, centers of ancient learning, where scribes were molded to preserve language, law, and commerce. But what they usually omit is how much time you spent just copying the same 5 signs over and over, your knees going numb, your hands covered in drying clay that flakes off into your sandals. They don't mention how the stylus doubles as a pointer, a writing tool, and occasionally a disciplinary instrument. Fringe scholars, once unearthed a student's practice tablet from Nippur with the same phrase carved 64 times. I will not mix up reed shelter with debt record. Below that, in a different hand, someone had added, next time he writes it 100. You learned the signs one by one. First came the basics waterman grain. Then came the trickster's mouth that looks like shout cow, that if tilted says angry God. You carved them until your knuckles cracked and your teacher nodded once and said, passable. Passing didn't mean good. It meant close enough that the merchant won't throw the tablet at your head. Lunch was brief flatbread and occasionally a smear of fermented date paste, which always managed to end up on your sleeves, then on your clay, then preserved for all eternity as a smear next to the word for barley. You once etched marriage contract with honey on your fingers. The result was unintelligible and sticky. You did not get seconds. Your classmates were a nervous bunch. One boy fainted during the sign test for Divine King. Another wrote river when he meant decree and was reassigned to water hauling for a month. The smart ones kept their heads down. The bold ones tried to decorate their signs with flourishes and were swiftly reminded that this was not epic poetry, thank you very much. You were somewhere in the middle. Good at wedge placement, bad at staying awake after midday. You had a habit of drifting off during dictation, especially when the teacher's voice grew soft and the clay cooled just enough to feel like a pillow. You once fell asleep mid-line. The mark your nose left in the tablet remains in the archives to this day. It's labeled Early Impressionism. Historians still argue whether Aduba punishments were strict or merely ceremonial. Some claim scribes were whipped for every mistake. Others believe the real punishment was simply having to rewrite the entire temple inventory by memory. You experienced both. Once you miswrote wheat transport tax as wheat transport curse and got to redo the assignment and sweep the courtyard. The stylus, your once magical wand, became an extension of your fear and your pride. You learned to press cleanly, to breathe with your marks, to copy with precision. Some students quit. Some were reassigned to shepherding. But you stayed. Because underneath the exhaustion, the repetition, the calluses, was power. Not loud power, not the kind that shouted or swung a staff, but quiet power, the kind that carved things into permanence. You could write someone's debt, and suddenly they owed it. You could write a marriage, and it became law. You could write a story, and people would whisper it by lamplight centuries later. Your teacher once said, "We are not gods, but our marks outlive kings." That stuck with you, and so you kept coming. Day after day, clay after clay, until the signs flowed without thinking. Until your hand moved before your mind did. Until you no longer dreamed of figs or magic, but of clean margins and properly aligned columns. And when the day came that you were told to copy the ledger unsupervised, you almost cried. Not because you were scared, but because your hands were finally ready. Historians may never fully agree on what Aduba life was like. Some describe it as harsh, others as noble. But you know the truth. It was hard. It was slow. It was the work of becoming someone worth trusting with a stylus. You are 12 years old and you have just committed a public linguistic catastrophe. It's market day, which means half the city is shouting about fish, the other half is shouting about goats, and someone has definitely dropped a jar of fermented lentils that will not be fully cleaned until next season's flood. Amid this cacophony stands you quivering behind a table at the Temple of Ningal's western gate, clutching a damp clay tablet with the look of a child who's just realized he misspelled a divine title. You were told to write 2 temple goats for the festival. What you actually wrote was goats of shame gifted to the priest's mother. You don't know this yet, but you will. Soon. Spectacularly. The man dictating to you was a junior merchant, slightly drunk, chewing dried figs, and speaking in an accent so thick it might have been its own dialect. You squinted, nodded, and pressed the signs into the tablet, confident in your scribal education. It's only when you hand it off for the official seal that the silence hits. Cold, immediate. Like all the gods just turned their heads at once. Mainstream historians often focus on the technical genius of Sumerian scribes, how they tracked rations, documented harvests, and preserved law. They do not mention the soul-melting dread of realizing you just insulted a high priest's maternal lineage in wedge-shaped writing. Nor do they mention how fast a child can contemplate alternative careers when a senior temple official's face begins to twitch. Fringe scholars, to their credit, have documented a few examples of scribal malapropisms from surviving tablets. Miswritten name symbols inserted upside down, or offerings meant to bless that instead cursed. One famous case involved a contract for a temple ox accidentally being recorded as a temple orc. The rest of the tablet had to be ceremonially buried. The scribe was reportedly reassigned to canal oversight, which was either punishment or an extremely specific form of exile. Back in the courtyard, the official examining your work holds the tablet up like it's started to smoke. He tilts it. He sniffs. He frowns. Slowly, he turns to you and says, "Do you often confuse family titles with livestock?" You freeze. Your supervisor, a man whose robe is always immaculately pressed and whose tolerance for error is somewhere between 0 and volcanic walks-over. He reads the line. He does not speak. He just closes his eyes and exhales in a way that suggests your mistake has spiritually aged him. You are dismissed, not with anger worse, with disappointment. You gather your tablets, your satchel, and your shame. You walk back to the aduba in silence. A fellow student offers you a chickpea. You decline. Even legumes feel accusatory now. Later that night, the instructor makes you copy out the sign for honor 100 times, then mother 50 times, then the compound for correct priestly goat. You do so quietly, diligently, tears only pooling once. Historians still argue whether scribal apprentices were expected to achieve perfection or whether the system allowed for forgiveness. Some temple records suggest that minor errors were corrected and filed without note. Others hint that serious mistakes, especially those involving religious language, could earn a young scribe years of remedial work, often involving grain inventories or the dissection of barley transport logs. You suspect your punishment will be somewhere in between. The next day, you are reassigned to receipt transcription. A dull task. Safer. Numbers and units, nothing poetic. You're told to keep your signs plain, clean, unembellished. The unspoken message, no more goats, ever. But there is a small gift in this humiliation. You learn precision. You begin to study accents, tone shifts, context. You triple-check familial signs. You practice wedge angles in your sleep. You develop the tiniest hesitation before carving each symbol, not doubt exactly, but reverence. You never write mother carelessly again. A week later, the priest's assistant passes you in the hallway. He smirks. Next time he says, try not to marry her to livestock. You nod. You smile weakly. And that evening in your private log tablet, you inscribe a single line. I will never again confuse goat with honored lady. And beneath that, just to be safe, unless it's in a poem, then all bets are off. You are now officially employed. You have a seal, a satchel, and a sunburn that implies some measure of importance. You've been assigned to the temple of Nana, goddess of the moon, and frequently terrible budgeting decisions, where your primary task is to transcribe labor allotments, inventory barley, and occasionally decipher which offering goat was the blessed one, and which was just a little weird in the eyes. It is an honor. It is a burden. It pays in onions. Yes, onions. You wake before dawn each day, shuffle past the same yawning guard with the chipped spear, and make your way into the storage annex where the scribes have their work tables and the onions are doled out like rations from a very specific vegetable-based god. You receive your daily payment, 3 small onions, 1 larger, possibly moldy one, and the vague promise of beer on festival days. You thank the clerk. You tuck the onions into your satchel next to your stylus and your dignity. Then you begin your shift. Mainstream historians tend to skip over scribe compensation Perhaps because the phrase 3 onions and a jug of something barley adjacent doesn't sparkle with academic prestige. But tablets don't lie. Surviving records clearly show payment in kind: vegetables, oil, fish, beer, sometimes bread, rarely silver, and never respect. Even the highest-ranked scribes, those working directly under priests or royalty, received their wages in foodstuffs more often than coin. This wasn't just standard, it was systemic. Fringe scholars have attempted to chart scribal pay scales across city-states. In Ur, you might earn dates. In Lagash, lentils. One lucky tablet suggests that a particularly favored scribe in Eridu was once paid in saffron-sprinkled goat cheese. You have never received goat cheese. You have received boiled leeks. Cold. Twice in one day. And yet here you are. Because scribal life, for all its literal pains, offers something other trades don't: permanence. You may not have silver in your pouch, but your writing outlives you. The contracts you draft, the oaths you witness, the epics you transcribe, those will sit in archives long after your sandals fall apart. And that, in theory, is worth a few onions. Today you're assigned to the temple granary, where your job is to record barley disbursements to workers. It's a simple enough task. Man arrives, says his name, says he's due 5 measures of barley. You check the list, you nod, you write the transaction on clay. But there are issues. First, everyone mumbles. Second, no one knows their own ration number. Third, half of them are trying to claim their cousin's portion using a voice 2 octaves lower. You develop a system. Ask for a hand gesture. Confirm against your list. Glance at the man's sandals. They're always a giveaway, then write. Carefully, efficiently, without wedge flourish. You're not here to impress, just to document. Mid-morning, a merchant arrives demanding 10 measures of barley for temple lamp oil. You check the log. He's only due 6. He argues. You write 6. He calls you names. You offer him an onion. He leaves. Historians still argue whether scribes had status equivalent to priests, or whether they were more like glorified middlemen. The answer seems to depend on proximity to power. Temple scribes had prestige. Palace scribes had danger. Market scribes had noise. And tax scribes, well, no one liked tax scribes. Your own status is ambiguous. You have access to restricted records. You can read what most citizens cannot. But your tunic is plain, your pay is edible, and your hands are dry and cracked from years of pressing reed into clay. Respect is conditional. Later that day, you're called into the temple archive to review a backlog of oaths. These are solemn promises, often financial, occasionally romantic, always dramatic. You find one from 3 years ago where a man promised to deliver 2 oxen, or else may the river spirits curse my kneecaps. There's a follow-up note: oxen delivered. Kneecaps remain blessed. You nod in satisfaction. Then you find your own handwriting. A short record from your first week. Sloppy, tentative, a little smudged, but legible. You remember the day, the heat, the terror, the way your stylus shook in your grip. You smile barely. That night you trade 2 onions for a slice of honey bread. A friend passes you a cup of weak beer brewed from barley too old to be noble, but not yet sour enough to regret. You toast to the moon, to the tablets, to your still functional wrist. You sit beneath the stars, lean back against a sun-warmed wall, and wonder how many of your records will survive. Probably not the goat ledger, but maybe the oath. Maybe that's enough. The clay today is hotter than usual. Not bake your tablets hot, melt down your sanity hot. It's midsummer in the temple courtyard, and the sun is a ruthless bureaucrat with a magnifying glass. You've positioned your tablet at a careful angle, trying to use the shadow of a pillar for shade, but the shadow keeps migrating like a disloyal friend. Your stylus leaves a steamy trail as it presses into the damp surface. Each wedge hisses faintly, as though complaining about being born in such heat. Welcome to the exquisite agony of writing during a Sumerian heatwave. Your tunic clings to your back. Your forearms sweat so much, that droplets streak across your freshly etched lines. You've already had to rewrite one invoice after your elbow turned a column of measures of barley into something that looked suspiciously like measures of blasphemy. You do not want to explain that to the temple accountant. Again, mainstream historians mention Mesopotamia's climate only in passing sundust and the occasional flood, but they rarely dive into what that meant for scribes. No one prepared you for how the heat turns clay into lava inkless styluses, into branding irons, and your forehead into a perpetual trickle of second-hand river water. Fringe scholars have uncovered personal laments carved into the backs of unused tablets. One reads heat again. Let this sun be swallowed. My hand drips like a priest's flask. Another simply says my thighs have fused with this mat. You are that scribe today. You press on recording a merchant's loan contract, 10 measures of grain interest payable in dried figs due at the next new moon. Standard stuff. Except that the tablet has gone soft. Too soft. Your symbols bleed together like they're gossiping. You try to firm the clay with a dusting of fine sand. The sand sticks to your fingers. You leave accidental dots everywhere. Now it looks like your wedge signs have chicken pox. You scrape it clean with the side of your stylus, start again. A beetle lands in your lap. You flick it. It lands in the inkless grooves of your drying tablet, where it will no doubt become a permanent part of temple loan history. You consider adding a line, "This beetle bears witness." You decide against it. You take a break to drink water, warm, thick, stored in a jug that probably last held onion brine. It does little to help. The sun continues its slow, blistering journey overhead, baking everything your back, your tablet, your ambition. You can't remember what it felt like to not be sticky. And then a priest passes by and asks you to rush a draft for tonight's moon offering. You blink at him. He repeats the request. You nod as one does when your entire rib cage is trying to evaporate. You fetch fresh clay. It's half-cooked from sitting in the sun. Shaping it feels like kneading dough inside a forge. You begin pressing lines to Nana Lord of Moonlight, this silver and barley offering be pleasing. And the sweat from your brow drips directly onto the word for silver, which now looks like sneeze. You wipe it. You ruin the line. You rewrite it. You swear. Historians still argue whether scribes worked in open air year-round, or whether summer months meant relocation to shaded halls. You've seen both. But the temple courtyard, officially, your office offers no such mercy. The shaded areas are reserved for priests or temple administrators, or the goats, depending on the time of day. You work until the clay becomes too dry to shape. The final tablet looks cracked, rushed, and slightly warped. You hand it off. You do not care. Back in your quarters, you peel your tunic off your back. There is a perfect clay imprint of your kneecap in your writing mat. You decide to leave it, a small personal archive of suffering. That night, the wind picks up. You sit on the roof bowl of cool water at your feet and soak your ankles in silence. The stars begin to blink overhead. Somewhere a scribe in another city is probably enduring the same thing. You raise your cup to him, to her, to all the inkless, sunburnt, clay-stained recorders of human nonsense. You drink, you sleep. You dream of snow styluses made of cloud in a world where someone else has to count the barley. You can hear him before you see him. The merchant's voice carries through the temple courtyard like a reed flute being played by a man who only knows one note, and that note is loud. He's shouting about inventory, about unfair measurements, about a shipment of dried dates that mysteriously disappeared into the ether, and most importantly, about the fact that you are now responsible for writing down every word of his impromptu performance. You brace yourself. Your stylus is freshly trimmed. Your clay is moist, but not soggy. You've positioned yourself in partial shade, an old scribe trick known as try not to melt while working. The merchant stomps into view, robe askew, breath rich with fermented fig. He slams a burlap pouch onto your table. Dates spill out like overly sweet accusations. Write this, he says. You dip your stylus, you do not sigh. Mainstream historians often revere scribes as calm observers, dignified artisans of data. But they rarely consider the real-world chaos of dictation, especially when your speaker is equal parts dramatic actor and barley-fueled tornado. Ancient Sumerian merchants, it turns out, were not known for their indoor voices. You begin to write. He speaks too fast. 10, no, 11 barrels of oil and 6 crates of pressed fish. The good kind, not the dry ones. Those were from the South Road, and you can tell because the salt weight put that in the salt. The salt is different. You blink. Your clay does not have a pause button. Fringe scholars have attempted to reconstruct the working conditions of scribes during live dictation. Several recovered tablets feature the same symbol rewritten multiple times in what can only be described as escalating panic. One tablet even includes a final line in small script. If anyone reads this, know that I tried. The merchant's assistant arrives with another pouch, this one full of dried onions and an official seal. The merchant waves it around like a priest anointing a goat. Mark that these are pre-counted. Except the small ones. Those are a gift. No, not a bribe. Write that, not a bribe. You glance at him. You glance at your tablet. You write miscellaneous hospitality. He grins. For the next hour, you scrawl out a contract so convoluted that halfway through, even the merchant forgets what he originally came to register. He veers into family history, recounts the tragic tale of a shipment lost to a jealous canal spirit, and compares his current barley quota to that of his cousin in Ur, who cheats, obviously. You press on dutifully, inscribing every line. Your clay is drying too quickly. Your stylus is bending. You've resorted to shorthand, slightly compressed symbols nudged closer together. It's a risky move, but you don't have time for elegance. A passing priest coughs near your elbow. You flinch. Your stylus skids. You have now written blessed barley from Blessed Mother's River, instead of barley unblessed from Middle Canal storage. The difference is not trivial. You scrape the line off. Recarve it. Add a clarification mark shaped like an apologetic wedge. Historians still debate how scribes managed corrections during live dictation. Some say scribes were allowed a margin for annotation. Tiny side notes like clarify with merchant later or speaker contradicted himself again. Others insist no such liberties were allowed and all edits required a fresh tablet. You hope it's the first because you're not starting over. The merchant, now out of breath, finishes his statement with a dramatic flourish and demands a summary. You read it aloud, line by line. He interrupts frequently, corrects a date, swaps a quantity, changes his mind about whether he liked the fish after all. By the end, your tablet is a minor miracle of negotiation, revision, and restrained profanity. He nods. He presses his seal into the clay with a grunt. You're not as bad as the last one, he mutters. She wrote everything backwards, claimed it was poetic. You smile tightly. As he walks away, another merchant begins to approach. You hold up your hand. Not yet. You breathe. Because this is the life of a scribe, half listener, half therapist, half ceramicist. You absorb every tantrum, decode every slurred syllable, and translate pure chaos into something resembling truth. You do it without complaint, mostly. Back at your quarters, you clean the clay dust from under your fingernails, wipe your stylus, and stretch your fingers one joint at a time. You soak your hand in cool water, watching the ripples settle. And you think tomorrow maybe someone brings you oil, not noise. But probably not. The king wants a poem, not a tax scroll, not an inventory list, not even a diplomatic contract involving questionable fish. A poem. A royal hymn to be carved in clean, reverent lines on a clay tablet the size of a serving tray and displayed in the temple foyer next to a statue of the moon god, wearing what can only be described as a very smug hat. And you lucky you have been selected to write it. You're not sure how this happened. Maybe your last oath transcription used particularly poetic spacing. Maybe your habit of humming during inventory suggested a hidden soul. Maybe the chief scribe just doesn't like you. Regardless, here you are seated at your cleanest mat, stylus freshly trimmed clay slab, smoothed to mirror-like perfection, and no instructions except, make it worthy of divine ears. Great. Mainstream historians will tell you that scribes in Sumer were multi-talented accountants, legal clerks, literary curators. They mention the great epics, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hymns of Enheduanna, and they praise the scribes who wrote them. But they skip over how stressful it is when someone drops by your table and says, "The king would like to feel his greatness in stanza form by sunset." You take a breath. You begin. You write, "He who strides the lands like a lion of justice." Then immediately erase it. Too common. Everyone's a lion. You try again. His voice shakes the reeds. The moon bows to his beard. Better. But still, you're not a poet. You're a scribe. You deal in units of grain and complex verbs involving canal maintenance. You don't do metaphors. And now you're expected to combine moonlight law and barley taxation into something that makes the king feel divine. You try again. From mountain to marsh, his rule extends. He tames the winds, he pours the rains. You realize you've slipped into someone else's hymn. You've definitely copied this before. You cross it out. The clay is starting to look bruised. Fringe scholars have identified dozens of these ceremonial poems in surviving archives, many unsigned but all written in the same cramped, careful hands of overworked scribes. Some include subtle complaints hidden between lines. One hymn to the goddess Inanna features a wedge mark that doesn't correspond to any known symbol, possibly a scribal eye twitch immortalized in clay. You keep going. You carve line after line invoking the king's lineage, his beard, his unparalleled wisdom, and his policies regarding agricultural calendar reforms, which no one actually understands but everyone pretends to revere. You reference stars. You compare his rule to a plow that sows truth. You even include a stanza comparing his justice to a perfectly counted basket of barley, which, while not romantic, is technically accurate. Halfway through, your stylus slips. A long gouge runs through mighty arm of Enlil. You curse. You smooth it out with a damp cloth. You recarve. The king's arm is now slightly less mighty, but at least it's not mangled. A junior priest walks past and says, "The king prefers similes involving tigers." You ignore him. By mid-afternoon, you've filled the entire slab. 42 lines, 4 stanzas, a closing blessing, and your hand, which now resembles an early attempt at sculpture. You dry the tablet carefully in the sun, keeping watch for stray cats, falling leaves, or divine winds that might smear your tribute to royal egotism. The clay sets, the lines hold. You exhale. Historians still argue whether scribes truly authored these poems or simply copied down verses dictated by temple poets. Some believe scribes had creative license. Others insist they were merely vessels. You feel more like a sponge absorbing command pressure and metaphor all at once, then squeezing it back into wet clay and praying it doesn't crack. You present the tablet in the evening. A steward carries it to the palace. You hear nothing for a day. 2, 3. Then word comes back the king likes the part about the barley. You nod. You do not ask which part. You do not celebrate. You just sit at your mat, stretch your fingers, and open your next assignment. A temple receipt for 112 fish. You smile, back to what you know best. But still you allow yourself one moment of pride, because now somewhere in the temple halls a slab of your work sits on a pedestal bathed in lamplight, carrying praise that sounds vaguely sincere and definitely expensive. And your wedges are flawless. He shouldn't have been carrying it. The tablet was too fresh, too wide, too heavy to balance one-handed on a reed mat in a crowded archive corridor. But the junior scribe, his tunic still clean, his confidence still intact, decided to transport it himself, probably to impress someone. Maybe a supervisor, maybe a girl, maybe the tablet itself. You see it in slow motion. He turns the corner. The edge of his foot catches the corner of a basket. His other foot, in dramatic protest, lifts skyward like a startled goat. His elbow jerks. The tablet flips, spins, and lands face down on the stone floor with the solemn finality of a god closing his ledger. Everyone in the corridor freezes. Silence. Then a single sound thwump. You don't move. No one does. Because this is the moment every scribe fears the catastrophic spill. The total, irreversible, clay-smashing, symbol-smearing collapse of hours, sometimes days of work. Mainstream historians admire clay tablets as sturdy, durable artifacts of ancient writing. And they are once dry. But while wet, while freshly inscribed and still soft with the moist optimism of someone hoping for a promotion, they are heartbreak waiting to happen. Fringe scholars have documented breakage trauma with unsettling specificity. A note from the Lagash Temple archive reads, Scribe Lugal dropped the annual livestock record. All figures must be reacquired. He is assigned to roof repair until further notice. Another tablet simply says, Do not carry with pride. The earth will humble you. You watch as the junior scribe slowly crouches beside the wreckage. His hand hovers. There's no salvaging it. Not the dedication to Ningal. Not the date stamps. Not the 27-line inventory of wine vessels now reduced to a smudge that vaguely resembles goat funeral. He lets out a soft noise, part sigh, part funeral chant, and begins gathering the shards. You stand, you help. It's what scribes do. Together you stack the ruined pieces onto a reed tray. You salvage what you can, a corner here, a preserved wedge there. Maybe 2 lines can be reused. The rest lost. Gone like a whispered vow in a sandstorm. Historians still debate how scribes coped with these accidents. Some records mention chants of forgiveness. Others hint at a ceremonial burial of ruined work under the temple stairs. Most likely you just started over, because there was no backup, no second copy. You were the copy. You hand the junior scribe a fresh slab. He nods. He doesn't cry. Not yet. You return to your own work, but you're different now. Rattled. Careful. You carry your next tablet with both hands. You cradle it like a fragile deity. You walk the long way to the archive, avoiding the step where someone spilled sesame oil last week. As you slide your tablet into its shelf, you think clay remembers. It remembers your care, your weight, your worry. And when it shatters, it remembers that too. That evening you sit in the courtyard watching the junior scribe begin again. His lines are slow, deliberate, beautiful even. Failure has taught him something the Aduba never could. You nod to yourself, you understand. Some tablets must break, so that the hand becomes humble, so that the lines come cleaner, so that the next one lasts. It's late. The sun has long since tucked itself behind the ziggurat. The priests have retired to whatever sacred nooks they sleep in, and you, of course, are still working. By the flickering light of an oil lamp that sputters like it holds a personal grudge, you sit hunched over a half-dried tablet, chiseling numbers into silence. You are transcribing tax quotas. For the 3rd time today. This is what it means to be a scribe when everyone else has gone home. The temple still needs copies. The barley still needs counting. And your left ankle has gone completely numb. Tonight's task. A detailed account of wheat and barley deliveries across 3 villages, 9 irrigation channels, 2 temple storehouses, and at least 1 farmer who insists his donkeys eat taxes. The head priest wants it on his desk. Sorry, altar by sunrise. You don't argue. You just soak your stylus in water, flex your aching wrist, and lean in closer to the flame. Mainstream historians often romanticize the scribal profession. They show you the golden light, the poetic lines, the honor of recording law and history. They do not show you the cramped quarters, the midnight deadlines, or the pressure of chiseling a 20-digit grain account, while your lamp casts a dancing shadow across your tablet, and your brain begs for sleep. Fringe scholars have noted occasional scribal complaints buried in administrative texts, tiny scribbles in tablet margins that read like whispered venting. One tablet from Ur includes a faint but deliberate line. Too dark to see too many zeros, too few onions. You feel this deeply. You reach line 14. Your fingers are clay-smudged. Your spine pops every time you lean forward. You shift to keep circulation in your legs. Somewhere outside, a dog barks. Somewhere closer, your stomach makes a sound like an ancient ox cart collapsing in slow motion. You write on. The problem isn't the work. The problem is the numbers. endless, exacting, unmerciful numbers. Each village has its own measuring system. Each tax collector has suspicious handwriting. And every third line seems to contradict the one before it. You stop, you count. Line 17 reads 7 measures of barley. Line 14, 8 measures of barley. You sigh. You pick up a second stylus, the one you use for error marking, and carefully carve a correction wedge. You add a note. Clarify in morning. You know you won't, but it helps you sleep. Historians still argue whether scribes worked in shifts or simply collapsed when their clay dried. You suspect it's the latter. You've nodded off mid-tablet before. It's never graceful. Once you drooled into a list of ceremonial ducks, you were never allowed to forget it. You keep writing. The lamp flickers. The flame dips. You rotate the wick. You burn your thumb. You don't scream, just hiss a prayer to Ningal and continue. You now have a blister that looks like the symbol for grain debt. Irony. Or a curse. You finish the final line. Total 348 measures received, 2 withheld for temple rituals, 1 missing due to donkey interference. You sit back. You breathe. The lamp goes out. You sit in darkness for a moment. The warm weight of the tablet in your lap. The sound of your own breath loud in your ears. You don't feel triumphant. You feel like a wedge in a much larger tablet, small, precise, necessary. You stand. Your legs rebel. Your neck aches, but your hands still work. And that for tonight is enough. You place the tablet carefully on the drying shelf. You whisper to it, "Be legible in the morning." Then you crawl onto your mat. Curl your spine like a question mark and fall into sleep with clay under your fingernails and numbers behind your eyes. Rain, in theory, should be a welcome break from the Sumerian heat. A soft reprieve. A cleansing pause in the dust-drenched rhythm of temple life. But rain in practice when you're a scribe is a clay-soaked catastrophe waiting to happen. This morning begins with clouds low and gray and suspiciously quiet. You can already smell the river in the air, that wet, briny musk of ancient mud and crocodile memory. The courtyard stones are darkening in blotches. And you, of course, have just laid out half a dozen fresh tablets to dry. Perfect timing. You race to cover them, arms flailing like an offended heron, clay still soft in your hands. One tablet slips. Another is already speckled with droplets. The wedge impressions, so crisp, so lovingly pressed, begin to blur at the edges, tiny rivulets forming like tears. You mutter a curse. The sky responds with thunder. Mainstream historians marvel at the durability of Mesopotamian tablets, and rightly so. Once baked, they can survive millennia. But that's the key, once baked. In their early stages, clay tablets are sensitive little drama queens. A light mist can turn hours of accounting into abstract art. A downpour. That's obliteration. Fringe scholars have found evidence of rain-damaged texts, smudged lines, water-warped signs, entire passages that dissolve into unreadable slurry. One particularly tragic example from a palace archive in Kish is known simply as the melted contract. It appears to have involved a complicated fish exchange and a very confused insurance claim. Back in the present, you've managed to stack your tablets under a sheltering ledge just in time. You wipe your hands on your tunic, which now features 3 new shades of brown. You glance at the sky and ask, "Really?" The sky offers no apology. You retreat indoors, carrying your stylus and your dignity like 2 fragile heirlooms. Today's work will have to take place in the scribal hall, a long, echoey chamber lined with benches, reed mats, and the unmistakable scent of damp sandals. The air inside is humid close, and carries the faint desperation of every scribe trying not to ruin their only copy. Your assignment today, rewriting festival records for the Temple of Enki, specifically the offerings brought by foreign delegates, jars of honey-carved, ivory-dyed wool, and something translated only as sea pickles. You don't ask. You flatten your clay, you dip your stylus, you begin. Outside, rain lashes against the reed shutters. The room is filled with rhythmic tapping styluses on clay droplets on wood, the occasional curse as someone smudges a crucial wedge. A senior scribe across the hall stands to rotate his drying board and steps directly onto a slick tile. He flails, recovers, and growls at the ceiling. You share a nod of mutual weather-based suffering. Your stylus slips again. You've written goat where you meant gold. You scrape the line rework, the symbol at a small prayer wedge for clarity. Historians still argue whether scribes employed assistants to help with weather-related disasters. Some texts suggest apprentices were assigned as tablet runners, ferrying drying pieces indoors during sudden showers. Others argue that weather was simply part of the test, only the most prepared scribes would succeed. You prefer to believe it was both. Mostly, though, it was bad luck and better reflexes. By midday, the rain eases. You step outside to assess the damage. 3 of your earlier tablets are intact. One has warped slightly at the edges, curling like a frown. Another looks like it belongs in a museum of tragic misunderstandings. You'll remake it tomorrow. For now, you return to the hall and finish the day's entries with renewed care. The air still hums with moisture, but your clay is holding firm. You scratch the final line. Let this record endure past the season of storms, and add a personal note tucked discreetly in the margin. Let it not be washed away by sky tantrums. That night, as you drift off to sleep under the soft drum of retreating rain, you dream of waterproof clay of umbrellas carved from ivory of a world where your words don't fear the clouds. But until then, you keep writing. Carefully, one wedge at a time. It's quiet tonight. The kind of quiet that feels almost deliberate, like the gods are holding their breath, or perhaps just watching to see which scribe drops their stylus next. You sit in the corner of the inner scribal chamber, hunched over a clay tablet that's already gone through 2 drafts and 1 mild emotional breakdown. The oil lamp beside you sputters, casting long shadows that dance across the walls like half-forgotten verbs. Your task, grammar exercises, not fun grammar. Not the kind that involves poetry or clever proverbs. No. You're diagramming Sumerian verb forms, specifically the ones used in ritual contracts which are precise, repetitive, and thoroughly lacking in mercy. You shift your weight, stretch your neck, and begin again. Mainstream historians tend to gloss over this part of scribal life. They focus on the drama, the royal decrees, the epics, the treaties. But at the core of the scribe's art is grammar. Line after line of prefixes, suffixes, subject markers, and oddly specific tense rules that determine whether you've just documented a goat trade or accidentally declared war. Fringe scholars have debated whether scribes actually enjoyed this part of their training. Some claim grammar practice was revered, even meditative. Others suggest it was a form of mental hazing, a gauntlet of suffixes to separate the truly dedicated from the romantically mistaken. You side with the latter, because tonight, for the 3rd time, you've written, "He gave the temple the ox instead of he gave the ox to the temple," which, while seemingly harmless, carries an entirely different legal implication. One implies an act of charity. The other implies a relocation of livestock with no proper blessing. You correct the line. Again, you stare at your tablet. The wedge symbols blur together. The verbs grow longer. The more you read them, the less they look like language and more like abstract art. You rub your eyes. You drink a sip of water that tastes faintly of copper and disappointment. At the next mat over, another scribe in training mutters something about ablative constructions, and then lets his forehead rest against his tablet. You understand. The problem with Sumerian, you've come to realize, is that it doesn't want to be understood. It's an agglutinative language, meaning words pile up like bricks in a temple wall. One verb can contain the subject, the object, the tense, the location, and whether or not the speaker was feeling particularly solemn at the time. You write a test sentence. "She offered the bread to Enlil in the 3rd month." Then you add the required prefix chain. It now reads, "Muna anda sumshi." You look at it. You look at the ceiling. You look at your stylus and wonder how many careers in canal repair are currently hiring. Historians still argue whether Sumerian grammar was taught through rote memorization or poetic examples. Some temple schools used chants, long, droning verses that paired verb roots with deity names. Others used punishment. One notorious tablet from a scribal academy includes the line, "Repeat until your hand obeys, or the stick shall speak." You've never met the stick, but you suspect you're close. You press on, line after line. You conjugate to write 20 times, then to eat, then to declare, which for some reason has 7 possible suffix options, depending on whether the statement is made at sunrise in the market or within audible range of a priest. You try a compound sentence. The merchant, having given the barley, received the receipt. You write it, then realize you've inverted the clauses. The merchant now appears to have received the barley and the receipt before giving anything. You mutter something untranslatable. Outside, the wind rattles the reed shutters. You check your drawing board. 2 tablets finished, 1 still soft. 1 you're pretending doesn't exist until tomorrow. You mark your grammar exercise complete, add a wedge of prayer in the corner, and stack your tools in order of least irritating. You lie back on your mat. Your brain echoes with passive verb endings and the haunting lilt of ablative suffixes. You whisper to no one, "May Enlil forgive my predicates," and sleep comes slow and grammatical. The name is long. It has 4 syllables, 2 honorifics, a geographical marker, and 1 character that looks like a squashed ladder, or possibly a stylized ear. You stare at the wax tablet in your lap, where the name is spelled out in beautiful sweeping wedges by the chief scribe's own hand. You have to copy it exactly, not just legibly perfectly, because this isn't just any name, it's the king's cousin. And today you're engraving it into a ceremonial trade agreement destined for the archive, the temple, and a very shiny wall plaque. You already feel the sweat forming under your tunic. Mainstream historians love names. They trace dynasties, chart marriages, follow shifting alliances like a courtly soap opera. But what they don't describe is the raw anxiety of writing the full name of someone who could, if displeased, have your sandals removed mid-street and reassign you to latrine census duty. Fringe scholars have discovered numerous name tablets that bear corrections, overwrites, and occasionally exasperated margin notes like, "He changed it again," or "Is this really how you spell, he who guards the reed canal with divine fish?" The cousin in question, Namtar Shulgi N, has recently received a new title, Guardian of the Salt Road and Honorary Overseer of Canal Inspection Ceremonies. You have to include the full thing, twice. And it must be aligned, centered, and spaced so that no wedge overlaps with the grain of the clay. You take a breath. You press the stylus. You begin. The first line goes well. You spell Namtar cleanly. Shulgi slants a little, but still legible. But as you reach the honorific portion, he who ensures safe passage and truthful ledgers, your hand twitches. Your stylus drags. The third character warps. You stare at it. It now says truthful lettuce. You scrape it carefully. You smooth the clay. You begin again, and again, and again. By your 4th attempt, the tablet is beginning to look weary. You can feel the clay judging you. The stylus tip blunts slightly from overcorrection. You switch to your backup tool, thinner, fussier, but sharper. A risk. Midway through the line, a novice scribe trips over a broom outside the hall and crashes into a storage urn. The sound makes your hand jump. Your stylus punches a crater where a gentle wedge should be. Now it says, "He who ensures safe pickles." You close your eyes. Historians still argue whether names carried spiritual weight beyond social function. Some believe a misspelling was a personal insult. Others argue that variations were expected. Regional dialects, family traditions, and scribal inconsistencies accounted for mild differences. But on official temple documents, there's no room for interpretation. The name must be right, because names are power. You begin again, this time slowly. You speak the name aloud under your breath as you carve syllable by syllable, title by title, wedge by wedge. You finish the final flourish and lean back. It's done, centered, even, no extra pickles. You bring the tablet to the archivist for review. He's a gaunt man with hands like dry branches and the unimpressed gaze of someone who has seen too many spelling crimes. He scans the line. He nods once. He signs it. You do not weep, but it is close. Later, you find a quiet corner of the scribal hall and collapse onto your mat. You rest your stylus beside you, palm open, wrist throbbing with pride and relief. You consider celebrating with an extra onion. You decide against it. Instead, you pick up a spare tablet and begin writing the name again. Not because you have to, but because after 10 failed attempts, you want to get it right one more time. And when you do, you add a final line. He who spells it true sleeps well tonight. They don't speak. Not really. The archivists of the Central Temple Library glide more than walk, communicate more with nostrils than words, and are known for judging a tablet's worth from 30 paces by scent alone. Their fingers are stained with decades of clay dust. Their sandals make no sound. Their eyebrows sharp enough to etch disappointment directly into your soul. Today you've been summoned into their sanctum. You carry a tablet. It is average-sized, carefully inscribed, still warm from the sun. It contains a record of barley tithes from 5 surrounding villages. A dry task, but completed with your cleanest wedges and absolutely no unauthorized metaphors. You think it's decent work, solid, maybe even commendable. The moment you cross the threshold, you regret thinking anything at all. The archive chamber is cold dark and deeply silent. Stacks of tablets line the walls like brickwork, organized with a system no one fully understands, but which the archivists guard with grim fervor. The air smells like old oil, bitter herbs, and ancient secrets left out in the rain. You place your tablet on the reviewing mat. One archivist steps forward, adjusting his robe with a disdainful sigh that sounds like the death of optimism. He lifts your work. He turns it. He raises one eyebrow. Mainstream historians often describe these library keepers as guardians of knowledge, but they neglect to mention how terrifying they can be. Not with authority, with disappointment. Archivists don't yell. They don't lecture. They simply inhale, pause, and tilt the tablet ever so slightly to imply that you failed to consider the emotional trajectory of your wedge spacing. Fringe scholars have found side comments carved into margins by embittered scribes. Archivist frowned, rewriting entire column. Or, tablet rejected, reason unclear, possibly too cheerful. One even reads, "No one has ever smiled in this room." Your tablet is handed off to a second archivist. She inspects the grain of the clay. She traces the wedge strokes. She tilts it to the light and squints at the line where you accidentally nicked the edge. It wasn't a mistake. It was a breeze. A goat sneezed nearby. Context matters. She does not ask. Instead, she replaces the tablet on the mat and writes a single character on the wax slate beside it, marginal. You blink. She clarifies in a voice so dry it could powder onions, alignment acceptable, symmetry inconsistent, final wedge shallow. You nod. You accept this. You make a note to cry later. The archivists move on. You retrieve your work and carry it to the mid-level storage room, which is archivist code for good enough to keep, not good enough to honor. The chamber smells like dust and old sandal straps. You place your tablet beside a pile of other marginals, many of which bear scribe marks you recognize from your school days. You are not alone in mediocrity. You take a moment to flip through the oldest shelf. There it is, a grain record dated 5 years ago. Line work impeccable, spacing divine. You remember who wrote it. She left for Kish 2 summers back. Rumor says she's archiving royal epics now. Her tablet is stored under the classification exemplary. You sigh. You go back to your desk. You sit. You begin again, because that's what you do. Not for praise, not for posterity, not even to avoid eyebrow-arch death stares. You do it because the tablets demand it. Because somewhere beneath the weight of all these wedges is the quiet hope that one day one of your lines will survive the judgment. Historians still debate whether scribes resented archivists or aspired to join their ranks. You think the answer is yes. Deep down, all scribes wish to become the quiet figure who tilts a tablet in the light, nods once, and silently approves. But for now you'll take marginal, because it means the work endures, and so do you. The shipment has arrived. Late unlabeled and accompanied by a delivery boy who smells like dried onions, and says only, "I think this one's for you," before disappearing into the chaos of the midday temple courtyard. He leaves behind a heap of tightly packed reed baskets, all marked with the same rushed wedge. Urgent. You peer inside. It's supposed to be an inventory of trade goods sent from a coastal city whose name you can't pronounce without invoking sea spirits. Instead, it looks like a prank by someone with a grudge against proper documentation. You find dried fish, bronze pins, 3 jars of what might be honey or might be lamp oil, a cracked turtle shell, and a pile of loose tablets, written in what you can only describe as scribal panic. The handwriting is chaos. Wedges bend sideways. Symbols blur into each other. Lines are misaligned. Some run backward. Others trail off mid-thought, like their authors were yanked away mid-sentence by divine intervention or sudden goat stampede. You are tasked with deciphering them, because of course you are. Mainstream historians speak reverently about the uniformity of cuneiform, how it standardized communication across cities and centuries. What they leave out is the very human reality that most scribes were tired, rushed, and had the wedge control of a half-asleep camel herder. And that's before you factor in regional slang. Fringe scholars have spent careers trying to reconstruct the meaning of messy tablets. Some argue that bad penmanship was a sign of youth. Others insist it was the natural result of clay shortages and long festival nights. One even theorized that poor wedge control might have been a sign of social rebellion, scribal punk, if you will. You prefer the simpler explanation these guys had bad days, just like you. The first tablet lists item counts, probably. You can make out something like 3 bronze or brooches large for the house of uncertainty. There's a column that might say fish or spears or angry gods. You decide to write down all 3. The second tablet is worse. It starts with a flourish, as if the scribe was excited, then abruptly descends into scribal despair. By line 5, the writing has warped into chicken scratch. By line 7, someone's thumbprint smears through the middle. You can just make out the phrase for the great feast, unless not, which is not helpful. You set it aside. Tablet 3 appears, water-damaged, then scratched, then redacted. There's a visible attempt at correction. Someone smoothed a line and recarved it with a different stylus. The final version says goods, received under protest. You nod in sympathy. You spend the next 3 hours transcribing what you can, guessing at the rest. You categorize items with caveats. 3 jars sticky, possibly honey, possibly weaponized. 12 fish salted smug. 1 shell ornamental or prophetic. 1 blessing shape unclear. You draft a new master tablet. It includes a polite note to the coastal scribes, suggesting kindly that next time they write while sober. You consider adding an emotive wedge to soften the message. You settle for an extra line of spacing. Historians still debate how tablets like these were interpreted in their time. Some argue temple scribes had glossaries of regional variants. Others believe entire departments existed just to clean up messy records. But more likely, someone like you was simply handed a basket of chaos and told, make it make sense. You do. You always do. By the time the sun dips low, you've compiled a final version that feels respectable, maybe even accurate. You attach your seal stack, the originals, under unconfirmed, and hand the summary off to the archive. Then you write 1 last line on your own private log, received 1 shipment of confusion, now slightly clarified. And as you wash your hands of clay, you realize in a world of broken baskets, it's the scribes who keep it whole. There is clay dust in your soup. You're not surprised. There's clay dust in everything. Your bed mat, your sandals, your hair, your lungs, your dreams. But finding it in your lentil stew tonight, gritting between your teeth like betrayal, is the final reminder you are a scribe, and nothing in your life is unsmudged. You sit on the floor of your small chamber bowl, in hand stylus marks, still etched faintly into the pads of your fingers. You gave up trying to keep the dust out years ago. It clings, it settles, It becomes part of you. Mainstream historians might marvel at how well clay tablets endure, how cuneiform survived flood's fire and empire collapse. But they forget the cost, the unrelenting, omnipresent, soul-dusting nuisance that is powdered, sun-baked earth. Fringe scholars once tried to reconstruct a scribe's average exposure to fine clay. One concluded, "It is not a matter of whether you breathe it in. It is how often and with how much exasperation." Another simply titled his paper, "Dust, the Scribe's Silent Curse." You finish your stew. You blow into your cup of barley water. Clay swirls. You drink it anyway, because tomorrow the tablets begin again. This morning, your first breath of air was thick with dust, stirred by a merchant caravan wheeling in from the east. They rolled through the market like a mobile sandstorm, dropping off baskets of grain and inhalable regret. You just swept your mat the night before. You now have to do it again. Your stylus pouch is dusted. Your tablet shelf is dusted. You once found a speck of clay inside a sealed ink jar. The archivist claimed it was symbolic. You're still not over it. And it's not just your belongings. Your body has started to bear the mark. The creases of your hands are pale with powder. Your nostrils itch. You've sneezed wedge-shaped sneezes. You once coughed, and someone said they saw the sign for wheat in the air. Your sandals scrape when you walk, not because they're broken, but because there's always a little ridge of dried clay beneath your heel. You call it your scribe's spur. It is not comfortable. Mid-afternoon, you're called to the canal records. It's a large project. Dozens of tablets all covered in mud and silt from being stored in a chamber too close to the irrigation ducts. You have to brush each one clean with a horsehair fan and a piece of linen. The dust that rises is ancient, angry, and intimately acquainted with your lungs. You wear a strip of cloth over your mouth. It doesn't help. You fan, you cough, you write. Historians still argue whether scribes suffered long-term health issues from clay dust. Some tablets list ailments of the lungs and throat among scribal complaints. Others claim it was just part of the job, like ink stains or philosopher's elbow. One particularly snarky commentary from a late-period student reads, "If clay kills me, may it at least record my death well." You relate. You take a break beside the river. The air is better here, cleaner. You remove your sandals. You soak your feet. Then you notice the clay on your toes and sigh. It never leaves. But here's the thing. You begin to realize you don't want it to. Because clay is your medium, your language, your legacy. That dust between your fingers. It's the same dust kings once used to send orders. The same dust that held oaths, births, marriages, floods, and farming schedules. It's the dust of memory. You dry your feet. You return to your chamber. You sweep your mat. You write a small note in the corner of your practice tablet. Today the dust was loud, but it carried stories. You smile. Then you sneeze. There's a goat in the courtyard. Not near the courtyard. Not tethered outside. In the courtyard. Right beside your clay, sniffing at your freshly pressed wedges with the thoughtful intensity of someone preparing a particularly pungent critique. You pause mid-symbol. You blink. The goat bleats. This isn't unusual. In fact, it's alarmingly common. Goats, chickens, wandering oxen, toddlers with jam-covered fingers, they're all part of the scribal landscape. You're used to distractions. But this goat, he's personal. He's chewing your reed basket. You get up. Mainstream historians rarely mention livestock in their descriptions of scribal work. You read pages upon pages about economic theory, temple policy, canal law. Not once do they include the sentence, "And then the goat ate the ink wedge." But perhaps they should. Fringe scholars have uncovered more amusing notes buried in scribal logs. One tablet, unsigned and possibly hidden on purpose, reads, "The witness refused to speak until his chicken was retrieved." Another simply states, "Disruption due to ox urination." Testimony delayed. You've experienced worse. Today's goat is almost charming by comparison. You shoo him gently. He stares at you with one eye larger than the other, as though judging your penmanship. Eventually he saunters off, having successfully creased your mat and left a hoofprint in the corner of your canal tax receipt D group. That hoofprint will now live forever in the temple records. You sit back down. You try to resume. Your client, a landholder from the outer fields, continues his statement, barely fazed by the goat. He gestures with a stubby finger and says, "And then I told her if the fish was already salted, it counts as partial payment." You nod. You carve. You do not ask who her is. You do not ask why salted fish and bride price are apparently interchangeable. You just write, because that's what you do. In a courtyard full of interruptions, you are a quiet island of consistency until the next goat. Mid-sentence, a chicken flutters past. You pause, you breathe deeply. The stylus wobbles. You correct the stroke with your fingernail and continue. Scribes you've come to accept are not merely record keepers. You're part diplomat, part animal wrangler, part linguistic contortionist. You learn to keep a straight face when someone asks you to spell Moon God's grumpy daughter as a legal name. You keep your wedges neat, even when someone is loudly negotiating the price of onions behind your ear. Historians still debate the reliability of oral testimony in ancient legal records. Some say scribes were allowed to paraphrase. Others argue for exact replication. What none of them address is how hard it is to transcribe anything when a sheep is licking your sandal. You finish the document. You read it back. The farmer nods, pleased. The goat has returned, now chewing a tassel from your robe. You decide not to care. Sa. You press your seal into the clay and hand the tablet over. Later at the archive, you file it under the usual category, property agreements, domestic and livestock related. There are dozens like it. Some even smell faintly of hay. You return to your mat brush off the hoof print and start your next record. A fishmonger with a strong accent and a very opinionated duck. You do not blink. You simply carve the first line. On the 7th day under the watch of the moon, 3 salted fish were declared satisfactory despite the duck's objections. Court is in session and it is complete chaos. You're seated on a stool that was definitely not designed for long-term use, stylus in one hand, damp clay tablet balanced on your knees, and a mounting headache forming behind your right temple. The judge is late, the accused is loud, and the witness is a man who appears to have forgotten not only his oath, but the basic timeline of events he swore to recount. Also, there's a dog under your table. You don't know why. Welcome to real-time transcription in an ancient Sumerian courtroom. Mainstream historians tend to depict these trials with a touch of grandeur. Wise elders, solemn declarations, justice handed down with clarity and divine blessing. What they don't capture is the sheer volume, the overlapping arguments, the dramatic pauses, the accusations yelled from across the courtyard, the fact that one of the litigants has brought 3 friends to shout, "Yes, he did," at random intervals. And through it all, you, the scribe, must stay calm, stay quiet, and write everything down in the correct order. Fringe scholars have recovered court tablets from the archives that show signs of extreme stress. Double lines where one would do. Signs rewritten. Margins full of corrective notations. One rare tablet from Sipar features a wedge-heavy footnote. He changed his story again. I do not believe him. You feel that deeply. Today's case. A boundary dispute. 2 brothers arguing over whether the fence between their date palm plots was moved, rebuilt, or simply imagined. There are witnesses. There is shouting. There are multiple references to a missing goat that may or may not have eaten the markers. Your job is to record the claims exactly as they're spoken. The first brother leans forward and booms. I place the post next to the boulder shaped like the goddess's foot. You write post placed near divine foot boulder. The second brother retorts. He placed it after I left for market. It's a trick. You write dispute of timing accusation of boulder trickery. The judge arrives. He's chewing something and doesn't apologize for being late. He sits, gestures for silence, and proceeds to stare at the clay in your hands like he's reading the past, the future, and your breakfast menu all at once. He asks for the testimony to be read aloud. You do, slowly, carefully. The first brother interrupts. I never said shaped like a foot. I said shaped like a divine sandal. You pause. You scratch a line. You add an asterisk. Then the judge asks for clarification on whether the goat in question had horns. You glance at your tablet. There is no mention of horns. You look up. The goat is here now, chewing something behind the second brother. It definitely has horns. You add a note: goat present, horned, silent. The trial continues. By midday, you've written nearly 24 lines. Half are contradicting the other half. The judge looks exhausted. The brothers look vindicated and betrayed in equal measure. The goat looks like it wants a promotion. Eventually, a decision is made. The fence shall remain where it currently stands. Both brothers must replant one date palm each to symbolize shared land. The goat is given no ruling. You finalize the tablet, seal it, and copy it into the trial ledger. You add a final line, as is custom. Under the gaze of the moon, this judgment stands. You don't write the part about the divine sandal boulder, but you think about it. Historians still debate how much editorial control scribes had in courtroom settings. Were you allowed to smooth contradictions? Could you summarize angry outbursts into polite language? There's no clear answer. But you know the truth. You recorded what mattered, what could be read without a migraine, what might help the next scribe understand what happened today. Back in your quarters, you wipe the dust from your sandals, stretch your cramped back and whisper to yourself, let the next boundary be clearer. Then you look at your next assignment. It's a marriage contract with goats. You sigh. You pick up your stylus. You didn't ask for this. You were perfectly content copying tax records and market tallies when the senior scribe approached, tablet in hand, and said, "This was started by a poet. He got bored. Finish it." You blinked. You looked down, and there it was. The start of an epic. Dramatic, florid, filled with metaphors that don't quite land, and a protagonist named something like Urzu, who prefers silence. A flood is involved, possibly a snake, maybe divine onions. It's hard to say, but the command was clear: complete it. Make it sing. Make it fit into the grand archive of myths and heroic nonsense. You stare at the tablet. The first 5 lines are passable. He walked beyond the 6th canal, past reeds that whispered his mother's name, carried nothing but truth and a broken pot, and met the wind who owed him nothing, but told him of the flood to come. It's your job to continue from there. Mainstream historians tend to treat these epics with reverence, as if every line was delivered by the gods themselves. They forget some poor soul had to write them, not just copy them, compose them. Stitch together stories from 3 different city-states, smooth out the verbs, and figure out how many metaphors about clay are too many. Fringe scholars have noted that some tablets show shifts in style midway through. Changes in stylus pressure, vocabulary, or poetic rhythm hints that a new scribe took over. One epic even contains the phrase, "The story picks up again from here better now." You both admire and pity that anonymous replacement. You pick up your stylus and begin. He asked the wind for its name. The wind replied, "Ask the storm." He found the storm asleep in a jar and traded his pot for thunder's secret. You pause. Not bad. You continue. With the storm's whisper in his hand, he stepped into the market square, where barley laughed and silver wept, and no man dared say the river lied. You're on a roll now. You write of a boat made from goat skins and pomegranate glue. You give Urzu a companion Ashar who never stops eating figs. You add a villain, the collector of lost time, who demands tokens from the dreams of children. You realize to your horror that this is actually kind of fun. You write until your wrist aches. You pause only when your stomach growls and your lamp flickers its last breath. You reread the tablet. It's ridiculous, charming, weirdly beautiful. You suspect it will never be filed in the official myth section, but maybe, just maybe, it will live among the fragments, the oddities, the miscellaneous poetic works that curious apprentices will stumble across and laugh at in 500 years. And maybe they'll finish it too. Historians still argue whether these unfinished epics were meant to be collaborative. Some say yes, that storytelling was a communal act, a relay passed down wedge by wedge. Others believe every break in a story was the result of death drought or distraction. You believe in the handoff, because today the story came to you, and you gave it an ending. When the flood came, he did not run. He opened the storm's jar, stepped into the rain, and became the whisper no one forgets. You press your seal beneath the final line, not as scribe, not as tax clerk, but as finisher, and you smile, because you didn't ask for it. But you answered anyway. The incense stings your eyes. It's thick in here, sweet, smoky, sacred, and entirely unhelpful for accurate handwriting. You're seated cross-legged inside the temple of Enlil, deep within the stone walls of the ritual records room, surrounded by priests chanting in a key that could politely be called aspirational. Beside you are 6 tablets, all half-written, and one increasingly impatient acolyte whose job is to hand you offerings so you can inscribe them faster. Today is a feast day, which means paperwork, because for every garland placed, for every goat paraded through the temple gates, for every bead dropped into a ceremonial basin, someone has to write it down. The gods may accept offerings, but the priests demand receipts, and that naturally falls to you. Mainstream historians speak of temple rituals with reverence. The great processions, the choirs, the fragrance of cedar and myrrh rising toward the heavens. They do not discuss the temple scribe crouched behind an incense burner, squinting through smoke to tally how many jars of sesame oil were sacrificed in Enlil's name before lunch. Fringe scholars, to their credit, have noted a fascinating volume of scribal work tied to religious feasts. Tablets recovered from the Temple of Nippur include inventories for everything from cinnamon-dusted lentils to one goose feathered reluctant. One tablet even features a note. Third goat objected. Required coaxing. You have already written goat 6 times today. You are just getting started. The current offering is a clay jar of honey, labeled first press, which implies someone out there is pressing honey more than once. You log it, you smell it, you sneeze, you smear the wedge, you fix it. Next 2 bracelets, bronze, supposedly enchanted. You write metal rings, probable magic. The acolyte frowns. You adjust, with priestly blessing. Better. Then comes the weird one. A small tablet is brought to you already inscribed in another hand. It reads, "One dream offered in silence." You stare. There's a pouch tied to it. You don't ask. You log it, dream intangible accepted. The incense swirls. A priest begins chanting something that sounds like a shopping list sung backwards. Another swings a censer dangerously close to your elbow. You lean away just in time to avoid a spark landing on your writing mat. You reach for the next offering record. It's a lump of clay shaped like a frog. You blink. The priest says solemnly, a symbol of rebirth. You nod. You write clay frog rebirth symbol, likely handmade. And so it continues. Offerings pile in cumin feathers, colored reeds, small coins, pomegranate halves, a mysterious jar of sacred paste that smells like defeat. Each is noted, described, and categorized. Some are edible, some are metaphysical. All must be documented because heaven forbid the gods' feast be short one bean. Historians still argue about the purpose of these records. Were they divine ledgers, human bureaucracy, or simply ritual theater proof that the ritual happened, stamped in clay, for all eternity? You suspect all 3, and while no god has ever appeared to check your math, the high priest certainly will. You've already been corrected once today for confusing ritual wine with sacrificial vinegar. One is sacred, the other is apparently just sour. By evening your fingers are sore. Your robe smells like 5 different kinds of smoke, and you're certain one of your nostrils is permanently closed from sandalwood exposure. You file the last tablet. Offerings received 47 items, 3 unclear, 1 emotionally significant. You place it on the altar stone. The priest nods. Your job is done. You walk outside into cool dusk air. You breathe, and the air, dusty, dry, gloriously unscented, feels like a small personal offering just for you. You've lost it. You've checked every shelf in the archive, every drawer, every reed-lined basket. You even looked behind the temple cat's preferred napping slab, startling both her and your sense of optimism. But it's gone. The tablet is missing. It's not just any tablet. It's a marriage contract. An important one. A very complicated one. Between 2 noble families involving land livestock, a shared irrigation channel, and somehow a clause about a ceremonial flute. It was sealed, signed, perfectly etched, and now gone. Mainstream historians often describe the Sumerian archive system as advanced, which is true, when it works. They used categories, shelving techniques, even clay envelope systems. But what they don't tell you is that all of those systems depend on humans, and humans misplace things. Especially when one of those humans got called away mid-task to write an urgent goat-counting proclamation. You were that human. Fringe scholars have documented several cases of phantom tablets, contracts and decrees referenced in other documents, but never recovered. One scribe in a temple archive wrote, "See record of oaths from the 12th day, if you find it." I could not. Another note simply states, "It was here, then not." You now understand those footnotes on a deeply spiritual level. You retrace your steps. You remember finishing the tablet. You remember walking toward the archive with it. You even remember stopping to talk to a priest about a dream he had involving talking donkeys and salt taxes, and then it's blank. Nothing. Like your brain hit a wedge wall. You begin asking around. The junior scribe shakes his head. "I saw you holding something, but I thought it was lunch." The archivist raises an eyebrow. "Perhaps it was misfiled under property, not union." You check both. You check everything. You even consider divine theft. After all, the marriage in question was fraught. The bride's father was rumored to have offended Enki by building a canal on Holy Rest Day. The groom's aunt reportedly invoked Ishtar's name in an argument about dowries. Could the gods have intervened? You shake that thought off. Mostly. By mid-afternoon, the panic has settled into something worse: paperwork. You'll have to recreate the tablet. From memory. You fetch a fresh slab of clay. Your hands are shaking. You press the first line. On the 8th day of the sacred month, in the sight of Nana, and under the witness of barley and bread, you pause. Was it the 8th or the 9th? Did they offer oil or wine? Did the groom's father really say, "As long as she minds the grain house"? Or did you just imagine that because it made a satisfying line break? Historians still argue whether scribes wrote from dictation or draft. Some tablets suggest a two-step system, a rough wax version, then a clay final. Others insist most tablets were first draft miracles. You now believe anyone who pulled off a first draft miracle should be declared semi-divine. You press on. You write what you can recall: the names, the livestock, the shared canal rights. You even add a note in the margin. This version reconstructed in good faith after loss. You bring it to the priest. He reads it. He frowns. There was a clause about musicians. You blink. Oh no, you had forgotten the ceremonial flute. He nods solemnly. The bride plays. The groom doesn't approve. It was a whole negotiation. You sigh. You rewrite the ending clause. And should the flute be played during festivals, the groom shall not protest aloud nor sulk for more than 2 nights. You hand it over. He seals it. You go back to your bench. You lie down. You stare at the ceiling and whisper to no one. Please let me never lose another tablet. From a distant shelf, something falls with a soft thump. You sit up. You walk over. There, between 2 treaty scrolls and a census log of fishmongers, sits the original marriage contract. Intact, unread, filed under MISC, domestic entertainment. You laugh. You weep. You leave it there, because you've already rewritten it. Because that tablet now has a story, and so do you. You've been summoned, not by a priest, not by the archive, but by her, the High Weaver, the mistress of textiles, the one whose looms clatter so rhythmically in the upper temple hall that even the river fish reportedly keep time with her warp and weft. She's standing at your doorway now, hands on hips, smelling faintly of lanolin and power. She says, "You're the one who writes the good labels. You blink labels for the ceremonial garments." She replies as if this is obvious. "They're never crooked when you do them, and the wedges don't fade when we fold them." And just like that, you're roped into the world of scribal embroidery. Mainstream historians rarely mention this realm. They praise the written tablets, the poetic hymns, the trade logs. But they never talk about the neat little clay tags that hang from temple robes, Festival sashes and sacred linen bundles, the ones that quietly carry phrases like "blessed for Enlil's feast" or "not to be worn" during eclipses. Fringe scholars have only just begun to take these garment tablets seriously. A recent dig uncovered a bundle labeled "Tunic of Second Morning Property of Temple Goat." Another bore the bold declaration, "This robe brings luck when worn facing north." And now you, the mid-level temple scribe, are being asked to carve 36 ceremonial clothing tags before the next full moon. You're given a mat in the weaving hall. It's loud here. Clicks, tugs, threads being thwacked into place. The air smells like dye, fermented indigo, overripe saffron. Something suspiciously beet-based. The weavers don't stop for you. They step around you with baskets of wool. One drops a spindle. Another mutters about a dye batch that turned too cheerful. Your first assignment, wedding veil for the bride of autumn. You begin. You write to veil the gaze to soften the omen. Blessed by Ningal for unions beneath full moons. The weaver nods. Make the edges pretty. You add a double border of ceremonial dots. Next ritual apron midwinter use only. You inscribe for the keeping of fire crumbs and lunar crumbs. Not suitable for goat herding. Someone giggles behind you. You keep a straight face. These are serious garments. By midday, you've written tags for rain cloak property of the fish oracle, night robe of silent preparation, socks of probable fortune, ceremonial, loincloth unworn. You begin to enjoy yourself. You take pride in these tiny wedges, these brief poetic markers of sacred clothing life. One tag reads simply, "This one makes you dance better." Another, "Wear only if you trust the moon." A senior weaver leans over and whispers, "Could you make me one that just says, 'Don't touch, it's been cleansed'?" You carve it without question. She slips it into her own robe pocket. Historians still debate whether these tags were functional or magical. Were they meant to instruct, to bless, or to protect? You're not sure, but you know one thing. They matter. Later, as the sun sinks and the weaving slows, the High Weaver places a new robe in your lap. It's soft crimson, shimmering with thread you can't quite name. "Yours," she says, "for keeping the name straight." You blink. You've never had a robe with a tag before. She hands you a clay chip. "Write something," she says. You hesitate. Then slowly you carve, for one who remembers what others forget. "Worn with humility and a very straight spine." She nods. "And for the first time you hang a tag, not for a priest or a god, but for yourself. The boat was not your idea. You're a scribe, not a sailor. You like dry clay, quiet corners and archives that don't sway beneath your feet." But the high priest insisted. "The river route is shorter," he said. "We need someone who can document the journey in real time," he added. And then with a grin that could only mean trouble, "And you haven't left the city walls in 6 years." And so you find yourself clutching a stylus aboard a reed barge, floating slowly down the Euphrates, surrounded by crates of temple grain, half-curious merchants, and a captain who swears by the navigational talents of his parrot. You're writing a travel log. The first line is hopeful. "We depart beneath clear skies with cargo intact and spirits fair." The second line is a smear caused by a goat stepping on your tablet. "Welcome to river scribalism." Mainstream historians may acknowledge river trade and transport, but they rarely note the scribes forced to document those journeys mid-current, mid-complaint, often mid-bite of dried fig. The sway of the boat makes every wedge a gamble. Your clayboard is damp from mist. You've already lost one stylus overboard. The parrot is watching you like it suspects you're stealing its lines. Fringe scholars have found a few travel logs in the river cities, often water-stained, full of corrections and utterly endearing. One read, "Cargo stable. Captain insists we are not lost, just following unfamiliar stars." Another included a final line, "Arrived. Never again." You suspect your own will lean toward that ending. The journey begins peacefully. You record the inventory, barley dates, oil jars, one crate labeled simply, "Divine Tools," which rattles ominously. The banks pass slowly. Fields, cattle boys waving sticks at said cattle. You press a calm line into the tablet. North wind follows. Favorable. An hour later, the wind shifts. You're beached on a muddy bank because the captain misread a sandbar and the parrot flew away. You note unscheduled stop. Spirits low. Goat escaped. At midday you share a meal of onions and something the crew insists is pickled eel. You decide to fast. Your hands are stained with river silt. You've switched to drier clay. Your writing is jagged. Your patience thin. You write the river does not care for symmetry. By evening, you've managed 3 full tablets, 1 for cargo, 1 for crew, 1 for the argument between the priest's apprentice and a merchant over whether a date pit counts as a snack or an insult. You record both positions. You remain neutral. Historians still argue whether these journey records were archived formally or simply handed off to scribes back at the temple to be rewritten in calmer ink. You hope someone rewrites yours. You also hope they include your note. Do not place clay tablets near the eel crate. It leaks. As night falls, the boat anchors near a reed thicket. The captain offers you a rolled mat. You decline. You sit beside the clay watching your last tablet dry in moonlight. You carve a final line. We float not only toward our destination, but away from all dry places. And then because no one else will you sketch a tiny parrot in the margin. You're back beneath the high walls of the temple. Back to the quiet scrape of sandals on sun-warmed stone. Back to the dry, familiar scent of baked clay and oil lamps. You step off the barge with your satchel slung low, spine, sore stylus nicked, and one surviving river log tucked carefully under your arm, still smudged with parrot claw. No one greets you. That's how it is. Scribal returns are not processioned, but as you pass through the temple gates, the world tilts back into place. You know these sounds. The crackle of the kiln, the soft clicks of styluses meeting clay, the faint chant of a novice struggling through his first tax oath. It's home in that odd way that only a place full of quiet repetition and permanent dust can be. Mainstream historians often write endings tombs closed, rulers named wars concluded. But they rarely capture the small personal ending of a scribe's journey, a return not to applause or gold, but to routine. And yet this is where most history truly rests. You unpack. You file the tablets. You see the ones you made before you left still stacked neatly, still waiting for seal, for archive, for eyes not yet born. You sit. Your fingers hover over new clay. What to write now? The room is dim, warm. Outside, a priest sings to a tree. Inside, a novice knocks over a jug. Someone curses. Someone else sneezes into a basket. You smile. You press your stylus into the clay. Returned. All items accounted. Hands intact. Mind, mostly. You pause. Then add a second line. River parrot remains at large, possibly divine. You write the rest of the record without flair, without flourish. Clean, even calm. The way your first teacher taught you. The way you now teach others. Because you've become that figure now, the familiar shape hunched in the corner whose wedges are straight and whose voice is soft when correcting tense. Historians still argue whether scribes ever retired. Some say they became priests. Others say they taught until their hands stopped working. A few speculate they simply vanished, their last wedge a mystery. But you suspect the truth is simpler. They just kept writing until the story was done, until the hands were still, until clay ran out. Tonight you set your final tablet of the day on the shelf. You mark it with a prayer wedge. You blow gently on its edge. You listen for the click of it settling in beside all the others, your life in brittle pages, cool and silent. And now you lie down. The air is soft. The walls are cool. The temple breathes around you like a sleeping beast, and your stylus at last rests. You made it. Through goats and floods, dust and parrot accusations, unholy grammar and lost contracts. You survived. And somewhere in the archive your wedges whisper still. The clay cools now. Outside, the moon settles into the crook of the sky like a tired god curling into sleep. The temple walls hum with night, the slow breathing of quiet stones and old stories. Even the cats have gone still. Somewhere deep in the archives, the tablets sit stacked hundreds, thousands each, holding a sliver of life shaped by steady hands and patient dust. You feel your own breath soften. Your limbs stretch into the mat. Your fingertips still carry the faint memory of reed on clay pressure and release line by careful line. It was always like this, simple motions repeated so long that they became their own music, a song without sound, a rhythm without drum. Above, stars blink without urgency. No ink, no papyrus, just wedges and will, just the soft art of remembering. And now, as the story's quiet, so do you. Your last thought drifts like smoke, not of kings or floods or even fish taxes, but of a tiny wedge pressed with care in the corner of a tablet no one will read. And that's enough. It's always been enough. Let the stylus rest. Let the clay dry. Let the night hold you like a finished word.